Back in 2018, I did what every developer dreams of. I quit my day job to start a software company. And while it didn't take off and I didn't get mega rich, it did teach me a ton of invaluable lessons that have made me a much better programmer now that I'm back in a corporate career. So, while I could probably go on forever about this, in this video, I'm going to run through 8 takeaways I had from starting a business and what they've meant for my programming career. But first, let me give you a quick backstory. I'm Mike Wers, I'm a back-end software engineer, and in 2018, I quit my job as a team lead at a bank to co-found a software company. And if you couldn't guess from that intro, it didn't go well. I went back to a day job after around a year. But during that time, I got to iterate on a number of projects, and I was able to also give myself a crash course in business and marketing and sales. And all in all, I learned so much from that experience, which has gone on to more than pay itself back in my career since then. So let's get into it. Number 1. I've learned to aim for a sort of A- on code quality. I think it's really easy and even fun to polish and over-engineer code far beyond what's necessary. And in the process of doing that, just wind up wasting a lot of time. Before starting my company, I used to be obsessed with learning all the architecture and code quality guidance out there. I could quote pattern books by chapter and page number. And on everything I developed, I'd spend so much time iterating and perfecting designs, building out abstractions, and endlessly refining my code. And then I'd also drive my team up a wall on code reviews by nitpicking every variable name and comment. But when building out my company, this desire to chase perfection really came back to bite me. Early on, I was building a really simple logging system that had to do some specialized request logging to Splunk. And the code, while working, was a little bit of a mess. So my perfectionist thinking took over, and I wound up spending days reworking it. And in the process, I took it from a single messy class to this kind of carefully crafted 15 class monster. And sure, it was elegant, but it also was huge and introduced a ton of code bloat that I was going to have to maintain going forward. And all of this wasn't adding anything actual valuable in terms of features. It had the same functionality, just also the bloat. And even worse than all that, I had wasted a ton of time building it. As I was merging it in, I realized that if I was paying myself my old salary, I'd have wasted over $1,000 in time developing it. It was experiences like these that made me come around to being much more pragmatic about my code quality now. I no longer endlessly polish my code into some dogmatic concept of perfection. It's just not time efficient. I now aim for what I'd consider to be a A- code quality, which is still good, just not perfect. And on that topic, that brings me to number 2. I try to watch out for how good advice becomes dogma. As I mentioned early in my career, I was obsessed with learning all of the industry best practices for how to design and deploy my code. And I became fixated on doing everything the right way. Some of my coworkers used to joke that I had dry tattooed on my chest. But the rapid pace of starting a company forced me to put many of these best practices to the test. And it was a bit of a shock to me then when I found out that many of them weren't as make or break as they claimed to be. None of my projects, no matter how big, suddenly burst into flames without them. In fact, I hardly noticed the impact of skipping most of them. Since that time, and watching the industry hype cycle continue to turn, I've started to become kind of philosophical about best practices and why they become so dogmatic. In my view, it stems from the fact that coding is messy and hard, and it offers a ton of room for creativity. And I think our brains want to seek structure and rules to help simplify that and make it easier, which is a noble goal. But the unfortunate truth is that many of the problems we deal with are far too complex to be reduced down into simple rules. And then indiscriminately applying rules can hurt just as much as they help. So to put it simply, starting my business taught me to see through the dogma, regardless of whether I agree or disagree with it, and to try to look for the original idea along with all of its nuance. There's always some good wisdom there, or it never would have caught on enough to get turned into dogma. Number 3, I wish I had read a few business books earlier in my career, as this was something that definitely helped me get promoted. A common complaint by my prior manager before I started my company was that I didn't, quote, understand the business. And looking back, yeah, I totally agree. I was operating in a really naive view about how businesses worked. And this sometimes would lead me to saying some really silly things in meetings, like, let's rewrite the entire payment system to teach the interns about clean architecture. Which is a true story, and not my proudest moment, though it's not quite as bad as it seems. But anyway, the business knowledge that I gained from my crash course studying while starting my company has really filled in a lot of gaps for me. I have a much better understanding now of how my role as a programmer fits into the larger organization. And fortunately, since going back, I've yet to be criticized for not understanding the business. And maybe even in some ways, I might be a little too on the side of the business now. But to recap, reading a few books on general business concepts changed my whole perspective on how software development fits into a company. And being able to relate my work to the larger goals of the business is one of those things that helped move me into a senior role and then onto being a principal. So this is something I wish I did earlier in my career. And it definitely could have helped save me some embarrassment too. Now, following along the lines of things that learning about business taught me, this brings me to number 4. Tech debt isn't going to kill a product, but a lack of delivery will. So I try not to be too surprised when the business refuses to prioritize fixing tech debt. I think you can probably start to see a trend here, but prior to starting my business, I was always a code quality advocate on my team. I had been working on a massive legacy code base at my prior job, and yeah, suffice to say, that system really needed some TLC. So I was always advocating for large-scale refactors and rewrites, and then getting frustrated when they were shot down. But the truth is, from a strict business perspective, delivering features is almost always going to be prioritized over fixing tech debt. And if you ever start your own business, you're going to have to confront the same exact trade-off, and it'll be your own money on the line. You'll get the choice to either deliver a new feature that might help bring in new customers, or rework some 500-line switch statement that, truth be told, isn't really slowing you down all that much. And I bet if you're ever in that spot, you're going to also agree that delivering features is going to be the more profitable choice. At least, that was a choice I made time and time again. Now, don't get me wrong, tech debt is still worth fixing. Even if the impact on your development speed is low, the frustration and confusion of modifying a 500-line switch statement still is a problem. And it also just plain old feels bad to keep adding on to that problem every time you touch it. But I also don't expect the business to necessarily agree with that reasoning. So, knowing that it's hard to get tech debt work prioritized, here's what I try to do now. For smaller problems, I try to slip tiny refactors into other changes, rather than breaking this work off into its own standalone ticket or issue. At best, it's going to sit on your backlog for a long time. And in the worst case, it might even wind up getting used as a bargaining chip as something to do instead of fixing larger issues. Now, for the larger refactors, I try to find a way to measure and quantify the slowdown that the issue is causing, so I can then try to estimate the real dollar costs of the lost developer productivity dealing with it. And then, if the issue is bad enough, I might be able to actually prove that it's more profitable to fix it than to take on some less important feature work. And that brings me to my next point about fixing a very specific type of tech debt. Number 5, many performance issues are most effectively solved by just throwing more hardware at the problem. And I know that may sound sacrilegious, but the truth is that buying more hardware is usually far cheaper than paying developers to fix issues. When building my products, I started to memorize a lot of cloud infrastructure costs. And I also became very aware of how my time is money, and every hour I spent doing something had a cost. And with that, I started to realize that most performance issues aren't really problems, at least not from a cost perspective. Infrastructure is shockingly cheap, so it takes a really massive performance issue to actually be worth spending the developer time to fix it. Now, thinking back over my many years at day jobs, I've seen this sort of misguided fix too many times. I once watched a coworker spend 3 days shaving 5 milliseconds off an async job. His justification was that it ran a million times a day, so it had to be worthwhile to fix. But in reality, if you calculated out that CPU usage, the total yearly savings on that is just $18. In another case, I've seen truly hundreds of thousands of dollars of dev time being spent in an effort to try to reduce an inefficient application's database usage. And the whole goal of this was really just to downscale a database server and save a few $1,000s per year. Again, infrastructure is cheap, and it's going to take decades for that to see an ROI. Now, when I'm confronted with performance issues, I try to do some napkin math and check if it's actually worth fixing. And of course, there's plenty of caveats here too. Some tiny performance issues still impact customer UX. There's some applications that are extremely latency sensitive. But the core of what I'm advocating for still stands. It's always worth thinking through the trade-off between developer time and the actual cost savings of a performance issue. Number 6, I learned that resume-driven development actually pays off, but I still try really hard to avoid it. As I mentioned earlier, in my prior job, I was working on a bunch of legacy tech for the time. So when my co-founder and I started building our products, we wanted to try new stuff, and we adopted all the latest tech and architecture hype for the time. We built around microservices, Kubernetes, Kafka, and adopted pretty much every AWS cloud service we could. And yeah, we knew in reality all we needed was a couple VMs to run our code. And we also knew that this was going to cost us a ton of money and unnecessary complexity, which it certainly did. There were long stretches where I was spending far more time doing infrastructure work than actually writing code for our products. But on the other hand, it was also a great resume builder. And from my experience as I looked for a job after winding down my company, it really seemed to work. Having all of the latest tech on my resume was a great benefit. And I think this is a shame because this sort of thinking happens far too often in the corporate world too. I've been on plenty of projects where people have tried to find ways to over-engineer features in order to grow our own resumes. And all this does is just cost us and the business in terms of more maintenance headaches and infrastructure costs. Sadly, I sometimes feel like our industry is kind of trapped in a cycle where we over-engineer our own systems in order to grow our own resumes. But when everyone's doing that, it just collectively raises the bar for hiring requirements. And then that in turn just causes even more resume-driven over-engineering as we try to keep up. I also think the effect of this tends to bleed into system design interviews too. As part of raising that hiring bar, we now drill candidates on engineering massive systems like Facebook clones, and then we turn around and assign them to work on an internal tool that considers two simultaneous users to be a traffic spike. In any case, my lesson learned here was that resume-driven development actually is very effective, but I'm still cautious about over-engineering now and still push projects to try to avoid it. And also when I'm doing interviews, I try to go out of my way to give candidates an opportunity to demonstrate when they design systems for the right scale. So even if they don't have all the latest web scale tech on their resume, if they can still explain why they didn't need it, that's a good answer in my book. Number 7, I learned that you need to market yourself, even in a day job. Getting your name out there and starting to grow a small reputation in your company is one of the best ways you can get yourself on interesting projects and get promotions. Before starting my company, I really doubted the value of any sort of self-promotion. I didn't understand that there's a whole spectrum of it, and it ranges from being very subtle to being very bold and in your face. So I only really ever noticed the bold stuff, and it seemed very silly to me. And truth be told, that's because it oftentimes is. Being too bold is how you wind up with LinkedIn posts about how planning your family beach trip somehow reminds you of a strategic product road mapping. But after studying marketing for my business, I started to see how subtle self-promotion is much more effective. All you really need to do is just figure out what your passion is and then go out and help others with it. And somewhere along the way of doing that, you'll start to establish yourself in your company as an expert on that thing. Over time, growing a reputation like this will help open doors for you at your company. It's something that I didn't do early on in my career, and it led to me getting skipped over for some big projects that I thought I was the perfect candidate for. Unfortunately, no one outside my team knew who I was, so naturally I was skipped over. Number 8, don't underestimate the value of developing your IT skills. I wish I could go back to the start of my career and tell myself that I should be doing an IT side project for every single coding side project that I did. Developing strong IT skills is really beneficial, even for someone who strictly wants to stay as a developer. Now, when I co-founded my business, I thought I was pretty decent at IT. I mean, I certainly wasn't a system admin, but I had completed some interesting projects. For example, I once had unintentionally tried to create a kind of stripped down version of Kubernetes to manage a cluster of Raspberry Pis. And I also extensively tweaked Linux machines trying to get more performance out of game servers that I used to run in my closet in high school. Anyway, it turned out that setting up an entire company's worth of infrastructure exposed a lot of gaps in my knowledge. And filling in those gaps turned out to be maybe the most beneficial part of starting my own business. Back in a corporate job as a developer, the skills that I've gained have been invaluable, and I've applied them in so many different ways. It's helped me to debug outages by being able to understand the full stack in depth. I've been able to take over work from overloaded ops teams to help keep my projects on track. And I'm a stronger system designer now that I understand the nitty-gritty constraints and challenges of actually deploying some of these systems. So my lesson learned here is how valuable IT skills are. And I now go out of my way to intentionally try to grow them. I do side projects like building a home lab that grant me exposure to tech that I would never normally work on in my day job. So there's 8 of my biggest lessons learned. And in the process of making this video, I cut so many ideas. So I want to run through another rapid fire batch, although there's a lot less structure in these. 1, it's not learning a language that's hard. It's learning the ecosystem around it. 2, pick a relational database server and learn it inside and out. 3, Postgres could probably do half your infrastructure stack, which may or may not be a good thing. but it should be considered. 4. The ability to write good documentation is probably the rarest skill of all, but nobody pays for it. 5. Don't denormalize your data to solve a performance problem unless you have no other choice. 6. The hardest part of building large-scale systems isn't in knowing the right high-level pieces to connect together, but actually knowing how to configure and tune the things so they can scale. 7. Design your database first, and then your API, and then figure out the code. 8. Even great programmers still write bad code from time to time, and not always intentionally. So there's 8 things I learned from starting my business, and a few extras. And again, this is something I could go on for far longer. I could probably make 20 of these videos, as this was just such an insanely informative year for me. But those few have stood out as some of the more valuable ones. Please like and subscribe if you like this video, and let me know what you think in the comments.